All right. This whole LinkedIn Live and the slight delay, it's quite a thing sometimes. Cool. It's a good thing we warmed up, gang, before doing that this morning. I'm going to be feeling those dance moves later on.
I've got my PT in already for today.
There you go. You've done your workout surgery recovery. So yeah, very cool. Hey gang, we have Megan Torrance with us here this week. Megan, you're everywhere a lot of the time, conferences, all kinds of places. So I'm sure that lots of folks have either encountered you in some place before, etc. But there may be a portion of folks who haven't. So let's get you to start by just telling the folks a little bit about yourself.
Sure thing. So I'm the founder and CEO at Torrance Learning. We are a full-service learning strategy, design, development, software, and data firm. So we help organizations really put it all together when they're looking at often digital, data first, really highly effective learning experiences at scale. So that's a big part of what we do day to day. Our passion is around professional development. So not only supporting the learners, but our fellow professionals in instructional design. And so how do we help everyone improve their game? And so that's our Agile courses and Llama for instructional design. That's around data. We're going to talk a lot about XAPI today. We're doing work I know. We're doing work in artificial intelligence and really helping the L&D teams bring the very competitive best to their organizations.
Very cool. And you are, as I alluded, you speak about almost all of those topics all over the place too. So, and we're always pleased and happy to have you join us. In fact, I think it was like 7 minutes between when I emailed to ask you and you replied and said yes. So we love having you join us here. Hey, we're talking XAPI, which is one of the things that you folks do a lot of focus work on, and we've sort of framed it as, hey, 12 years in since XAPI was officially released, and of course it was kicking around as Tin Can in its development cycle, earlier than that. Let's talk about, where you think we're at as an industry in terms of using XAPI, highlights, and I won't say lowlights. There's no lowlights, but not necessarily even cons if we're thinking of pros and cons, but maybe some of the dips in the trends too that we can based on what you folks have been seeing. So if there was one thing that you wanted that top of mind about XAPI in 2025, what would your initial reflection be?
My initial reflection is it's getting real. Right, so that the Gartner hype cycle, right?
Right.
And I met the two of you through the early days of XAPI, right? Before the first release, and man, the hype was high, right? We were all super excited, right? So that the Gartner hype cycle, it starts kind of like something emerges and then it goes this super high spike, right? This peak of inflated expectations. And man, did we have a lot of very high expectations, right? The challenge then is that whenever you set overly high expectations for something, then it crashes down, because then we figure out it's actually not only going to solve all of the world's problems in a single data standard, but it also requires work to do. More work than the last data standard required, at least at this point, right? I'm sure SCORM was hard when it first started. SCORM became so successful, right, that replacing it is really, really hard. So I think that that trough was really hard, and we're working our way out of that trough, right? What comes after that is practical application and real benefit. And we're starting to see that. And there's some work around, like, how do you get over that trough? And you get over that trough, the three of us and a whole bunch of other people tirelessly keeping at it and building it and forcing it and working it, not forcing it, but like holding that flame. And we've been holding that flame and using it and having great use cases. And now we're starting to see more maturity. We can talk about like what I think of mature technology looks like. But yeah, that's where we are.
Yeah, I was, and of course, I too was thinking about, hey, way back when we met and we went to so many of the XAPI shootouts, almost as they were, and the pre-guild meetings that a lot of folks probably on this call attended as well. And I've always enjoyed, I'd have to say about your company is, to me, they really help organizations put the difference, make the difference, because that's what training is, to make the difference in it. But of course, doing the training and making sure it makes a difference sometimes is a bit of a challenge. And when I think of XAPI and the promise early on, it was, hey, we can basically start to assess and provide all this other information that can better help us make a difference. And you mentioned SCORM, and I think one of the beauties about SCORM from the L&D perspective is, as long as the tech side fixed their stuff and did their stuff, there wasn't much to do. You know, you had the things, you didn't really have to think about it. It was, you know, you had your box and you couldn't go outside that box, but at least for the most part. There are some exceptions, of course. But with XAPI, it's a lot easier to go outside the box. And then we're faced with, well, geez, what do I do? And I saw that challenge over and over again. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about how some of the people have started to deal with that, and maybe how that's changed since we first launched, because the possibilities are still the same.
The possibilities are still the same, but I think we have some more definition around how we talk about what we're doing in the course. Right? I have this fantastic slide in one of my slide decks, and it's an instructional designer with a suitcase, think of that as your zip file, just throwing it over a hedge. Right? And that's what we can do with SCORM, right? I make my file, I send you my zip file. It works. Like I don't have to, and which means an instructional designer can throw a course over the wall at the LMS administrator. And of course, we're just talking about e-learning here. In a minute, we're going to have to talk about the fact that XAPI is not just about e-learning, but right, I can just throw a course over a wall at an LMS administrator. The LMS administrator can then run every single report available to them on that course, and they never have to talk to the instructional designer again. It doesn't matter, right? Because that LMS administrator knows every bit of data that is ever going to come out of any e-learning course, right? So and I've got my start in this career deploying learning management systems. And I could tell you every report you would ever need because I knew every piece of data you would ever have, right? Before you even turn the thing on. So that becomes different. So right now, actually, I spent my morning with Meg Fairchild and Matt Cleaver this morning going through a document that we will provide to a client that says, for these modules, these are the data elements we're sending. These are the data elements we could send, but we're not. We're turning those off, so we can talk about that. These are the key activities in this course. So what we're doing here is we're identifying how do we know a learner is struggling, right? And we decided, you know, you get a quiz question wrong, that's not a struggle. But if you get it wrong twice, that might be something we want to start paying attention to, especially at scale. Right? So what we're doing is we're saying these are the questions that we actually really care about getting wrong. Not just any question, but like there's some, we're applying the Apply Synergy's critical impact of failure scale and saying these things, if they get this wrong, it's really important. right? And we're serving up remediation. How do we know that somebody got the remediation? And this, and all of this, right, is something that we have to communicate to the future report developers, right, and the future users. Like, this is the important data. We're sending you a whole bunch of stuff, right? This is the important stuff. So the instructional designer can't just stop at pushing publish and emailing a file. Nor should we, right? Right. So this is important.
That's one of the things that I think also attracts so many folks on our side of the instructional design is that to XAPI is that, yeah, we often, so many of our, the folks that we talk to don't even have access to the LMS reporting to begin with. And then also the gaps in what we would actually value often, like you're saying, where someone's struggling, whereas the LMS is more focused on completion. Oh, they completed that page, so they moved on to the next page. So it knows that they're completed, the course or whatever, but that lack of introspection from the LMS side is one of the key things that anybody I've been talking to wants, is the key driver of why they're looking into XAPI, is to get that greater introspection, like you said, in what are they doing in an activity, or even being able to drill better into patterns around, assessment scores that an LMS can report on, average scoring probably, and some basics, but drilling down to where are the things that people are getting wrong, because that again can indicate something we need to resolve as instructional designers, for sure.
Well, and Chris, I think that's a key point. And our DemoFest project at DevLearn, Matt and I showed a learning experience where we have a dashboard, an XAPI dashboard, that shows not only a drill down into individual learner performance, but also a course owner level dashboard that shows how the course experience, or actually a whole curriculum, not just one course, how a whole curriculum is going down, right? And where are people having challenges? What might we want to focus in on changing, so we can actually use data to improve the learning experience.
Yeah, that was something I was thinking about. And of course, everyone's, thinks of the classic Addy. And one of the things I noticed over the years is that the A and the E tend to fall off sometimes, or completely off. And it's a little bit a victim of, hey, you have limited what you can do, maybe a survey there, but especially for the E, and of course, going into it, the A part of this, you have a lot more data and you can have that continual evaluation. I'm curious, with that dashboard, other examples, can you share something that during some of the training, some of the clients you worked with, that you found out that XYZ was happening, and that enabled you to go ahead and say, hey, we need to reevaluate. Maybe you did and actually change some of the training because of it, or at least you got to the point of, hey, when you get the next budget, this is going to be a big change.
So let's talk about that latter one. We had one client that, we upgraded from a static screen by screen learning experience. We're completely revamping everything. So we built, vertical scrolling, and in that conceptual shift, right? All of a sudden we lost the being dragged through the course by the voiceover, right? Where the voiceover sets the pace. So now the learner sets the pace, which they kind of actually really like, right? Go figure. Agency and adult learning theory and all that goodness. I know, right?
Whoa, slow
Wait,
down.
You're not being compliant.
It's a little crazy, right? But the what we did hear from learners, and from the education committee, this was the American Spinal Injury Association, they said, well, I do kind of like the ability to listen and go look at something else, or listen to something. So we said, great, we're going to put an audio track, kind of like a podcast. You got to National Public Radio or whatever, and you have the ability to, just listen to this article. So we put that at the top of every screen. But what we did was we collected XAPI data. Who completes the screen, right? Each chapter, who completes a chapter by reading, who completes a chapter by listening. And what we had was some really interesting data, right? About a third of the people never clicked the listen button, right? A third of the people always clicked the listen button. And another third of the people clicked the listen button for 1 to 3 chapters, and then never did it again. Right. So then, right, to Paul, to your question, right, the next time we go through, we then can have a conversation. This is just data, not a decision, right? But we have a conversation. We can say, okay, a third of your learners actually really like this podcast thing, and it's not even accessibility, right? Because if you needed the accessible version, use a screen reader, and you go a whole lot faster than our podcast version, right? So it becomes a learner preferences and a personalization aspect for the course, and we have data to back up that conversation.
Cool. Yeah, that's actually the breakdown is like kind of magical, the exact sort of 30ness of it.
it was very 30ness. I mean, these are rough.
Yeah, but
I'll
still,
tell you, it wasn't exact, but it was like,
but
for rough numbers, there were
yeah,
3 distinct groups, and they were all kind of within a margin. I'll get nerdy, within a margin of error appropriate for the sample size. It was roughly distributed.
neat.
Well, and I was thinking there too, especially that rough distribution and distribution, that would be very easy if you didn't have the data to have qualitative bias when you go ahead and who you talk to, and you'd find out everybody loves this or everybody hates this or doesn't care about it there. I was thinking of some of our other clients, and some of the things that I've run into and they talked about is the instructional designers were, do we really need to add this downloadable PDF version of it or some of these other items into it? Because they had the qualitative experience of, I don't think these people are really using it. So they were looking to start to leverage reporting in some XAPI, because of course you can't get that information elsewhere. Are these even being used? If they're only be used by X%, is that benefit enough given the cost to do the extra development, which may be small depending on the tooling you're using, or maybe quite significant?
And I think what we're also looking at is the ability to use XAPI data to store text entry data, right? Feedback, or we have an AI case tool, right? So we our case challenge, right? Learners presented with a situation, and all they don't have multiple choice. They have a free text entry box, right? And what do we do there? What do people do there? We're using XAPI to save that, and then we have that data source that we can run AI analysis on. We can run sentiment analysis. We do all sorts of stuff. But even before AI and all this goodness, I remember when Domino Flow first came out, and we had a client that was building 2 courses super similar to each other, and we wanted to know, do learners want to scroll up and down or side to side? And so we built these 2 courses, and one scrolled up and down mostly, the other scrolled side to side mostly. They all the same graphics, all the same stuff, and they were like crazy graphics, right? Super fun client, custom fonts, right? We really bugged you guys.
I remember that.
Right? So bad. But what was interesting there was we had text boxes in the course that said, what do you call your customers? Or what would you say in this situation? They weren't scored, they weren't graded. The days before Gen AI and accessible AI to the rest of us, right? And we just did a review on that data. Were people entering quality responses to those questions? Because that told us they were engaged. Mm-hmm. And so that was an indicator for us. So yeah, there's so many things you can do. We're just talking about e-learning though.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I know, and I was starting to think about that too. And I remember a conversation with some people talking about their instructor-led and want to create more engagement there, but also single sourcing, leverage some e-learning in there, but bring the classroom experience. And I'm like, well, XAPI is the standard that's going to open up your world to create that engagement. And obviously you've been thinking about that too. So,
well, and here's the thing, right? People learn through other experiences too, outside of the LMS, which I know is shocking to almost everybody here. But we can use XAPI to track that. So Shalita Murdoch's question in the chat here, right? How do small businesses with where we're looking at B2B solutions and online, but how do we use XAPI to track things? And I want to talk, Shalita and everybody else who has a similar question, how do we get outside of the e-learning, right? So in that situation, by the way, Shalita Murdoch, brilliant, met her in Taiwan last year. So what we're looking at is really a factor of, right, how do I use lightweight tools to deliver? I may not need a whole LMS. I may be able to use XCL from Build Capable or the Veracity's right, launch product, right? I can build very lightweight outside of an LMS and get many of the same kinds of functionality that a short shot, a short engagement like a B2B training sale would entail. I can still collect really rich data, but then I can start getting data from other things. I could build a survey that pulls data back in, and then I can start connecting what do people do in a survey with what they do in an online learning experience. I might use maybe I use Mobile Coach and have a chatbot, right? A reinforcement learning chatbot after the fact. I have the ability to send data from that into my learning record store. And then I can start having really rich views of what's happening inside the learning, but then my chatbot and my surveys can be asking what's going on outside the learning. Right? Even better if I can be connecting, right, depending on the nature of what you're teaching, but if the work that people are doing is done and recorded in a system work, I can pull data out of that and convert it to XAPI, and then I have it all in my learning record store, and I can start making some really interesting analyses about what's going on. We're not seeing a lot of that yet. That was part of, right, that peak of inflated expectations. We're going to take all the performance data too, and we're going to put it in here. And we ended up not seeing that as much. But a lot of the data that goes into a learning record store right now, a not immaterial amount of that data doesn't come in as XAPI, gets converted on its way in.
Yeah, and I was thinking about some of those expectations and wondering if you ran into them, but I think of the classroom, but also e-learning. One of the coolest things about XAPI that set it apart from SCORM, which there are many, is that data was not quite a live stream from a technical standpoint, but it was data that you could pull back in. And so whether it was an e-learning course where you wanted to pull back in a classic leaderboard, or I thought about your typing in, and sometimes when you're typing your thoughts, you're like, I wonder what other people are saying. You could have a word cloud come back just to see, not because you're right or wrong, just to see what other types of things people are saying. But especially in the classroom, when you're doing off your individual group exercises or other exercises, if some of that data was being fed back to the instructors or other groups to reflect on it, which, in some ways, traditional classroom it is because we vocally go ahead and provide that there. But I was thinking this could provide a much richer experience. And I was wondering if you had started to see any of that and what that was looking like.
Starting to, so little bit of work we've been doing with Wendy Morgan at the University of North Carolina. She's got a number of research projects going on, which I love, right? So we're getting, by the way, we're using XAPI as components of university research around learning. It gives us so much data for those researchers to mine through. It's fantastic. We built some dashboards for Wendy. And so she's got a team of folks making e-learning that's really, really very wired up with XAPI. We then build dashboards that give instructors. So if you have a blended learning experience, you might do some e-learning and then you come into a classroom. We're giving those instructors a heads up of who's coming in. Where do they need to spend their time? And all of a sudden, we're starting to get the data that allows for really personalized learning experiences and a meaningful, personalized flipped classroom, which is pretty exciting, right? So I think that there's some real promise there. Here's the thing, right? And AI kind of sucked all the air out of the room a few years ago, but we're getting back to, hey, you know what? Data-informed decisions are really good decisions. Right? Data-informed decisions are really good decisions. And how do we get the data for this? Right? A lot of instructional designers have gotten used to only having SCORM data, right? And when you only have SCORM data, you don't build the skills to work with data. You don't know what to do with data. And data, right? There's a lot of nuts and bolts that make this an intense project, right? There's a lot of nuts and bolts, but we got very used to SCORM data and not being able to give interesting data to the business. And then, right, then what happened was the business stopped asking us for interesting data. The business learned that all we could give them was completion data. So now we all get hot and bothered under the collar about, like, I've got the LTEM model, I can do better evaluation, I can do all this stuff, right? And when we go to the business, they're like, no, we just want to make sure they completed it. In no other function in the organization is that acceptable. So we've got to work ourselves out of a little, we've kind of got this learned helplessness around data. And then we've taught everybody else that. So that's my little soapbox.
No, it's a good one. I think back to the days when training was a cost center and you paid for your seats either through external fees or whatever, and you paid by how many hours that they got in there. And we got out of this and got into that box. And I think of the instructional designers that came out and was like, or excited, they're thinking about data, they think about analysis, and they learned either they couldn't do that or no one cared. But you make a great point, is what other area in the organization just cares a Boolean yes or no? It was done. They care about the results on it. Yeah, I delivered this webinar, but how many folks attended there? Was there interest during it there? What was a follow-up on that? Yeah.
I think we have a lot of opportunity right now, right? I'm working with a team of learning product managers, and they're working on how do they create a centralized dashboard around what's going on with all these disparate learning sources. We're so siloed, and we have this opportunity to normalize this data, right? Speaking of which, is a question Rajendran has in the chat. I'm looking over here. Can XAPI be helpful in analysis of YouTube courses? Well, I'm going to maybe extract that, right? Leveled up video in general, right? Yes, there's an entire rich data profile around video learning that is fascinating. And instead of, right, did I complete it or not? Where did people pause? Where did people drop off? Where did people scrub back to or seek ahead to? How long did somebody spend in a particular video? That's super useful information if what we're trying to do is hone those videos, right? That's super useful. So there are data wrappers, and I'm going to see if we can get a link to Jeff Batt's video wrapper that will help. Basically, it's a video player that you put around a video, and you can then start sending data to your learning record store.
Oh, we've got folks that we've been speaking to who, that's actually one of the main drivers of XAPI is, are people actually watching the videos that we're building? Should we be doing this differently? Should we be spending the money on a video, development cost, etc.? And yeah, are they, everybody's dropping off after 30 seconds. Well, maybe they feel that they're done. That's enough information that they needed on it, etc. So it just turns back and gives us the opportunity to say, hey, are we doing a good thing? Are we doing a helpful thing? Is it making a difference? And also, frankly, hey, how do we distribute our budget differently based on the the data, if that's something that we need to contend with?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Reminds me a little bit of our chat last week with Bianca there, talking about marketing, and marketing looking at the videos. They certainly look at which videos are getting the more attention, and the folks that are bigger, they're looking at what aspects of the video, when did it peak, just like you hear on television and stuff, and for some of the different shows. And I think that's one of the beauties about that. And you kind of spoke to some of the cases where you got some of that data back. Are there any other examples that you can think of where, hey, we learn this thing about the training. The great one was the AB with that earlier client there, but that really informed a change in what you were doing, either moving forward or that the type of training that they were looking to deliver.
I have slightly different use case I want to share with you. Becky Goldberg at Travelers is doing some really, really interesting work, right? And at an XAPI users conference a couple of years ago, she shared this fantastic learning experience. What they wanted to do was help people learn about different aspects of a whole curriculum that they had provided around diversity, working with different people from different backgrounds than you. And their goal was that people self-explored the curriculum in whatever order they wanted to. They did it on a regular basis, and that they saw different dimensions of the curriculum as they went. Okay? So she built a launcher page that would then, when you launch the page, right? So Megan Torrance launches the page, it reaches back into the Learning Record Store, grabs all the data about the learning experiences I've already done. And then that page dynamically tweaks itself and says, you've already seen this, 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 and this. So what about this, right? Here are some areas that you haven't seen. And I thought this was kind of cool because it really supports that learner agency. As well as it's telling Becky and the learning team what topics are popular, what's going on, even if these things weren't in the learning management system, even if these things weren't being tracked, even if these things were externally provided, right? We can see that they left this link and came back. We may, even if we don't know what happened there, right? We could see that they left this link and came back, and all that's stored in the Learning Record Store. So that was some super cool work that she did. That's the kind of work we want to be doing, right? How do we set up these experiences for people that help us understand? We've got a project where we'll be looking at how people perform during learning with an intent to make sure that we're giving them the right kind of remediation, right? If they can get, right, can we give them the easy remediation, easy and cheap to deliver? Do we have to do the expensive remediation that we know works, but is also really expensive and time consuming, right? Can we make that path meaningful for the individual and the organization? Right, so we're really looking at giving individuals what they need in that learning experience. And I think that's pretty cool. The team from Humana is looking at, like, how do they identify if a learner is struggling? Right, that's where we can support folks, rather than what Rob Houck at LearnShare calls sheep dip training. Right, we don't know which one of you sheep has lice, so we're just going to dip you all in it, right? And therefore we say you're covered. So
yeah, that
covered in sheep dip.
Yeah. We're all covered, and that kind of thinks back to compliance. Hey, we need to make sure everyone's covered. And I've seen hesitancy a lot, but I'm kind of excited about what you just said there, and some changes we've done to Domino just recently too. And that, like, compliance, you have the same content over and over every year. Let's face it, some of it forget more than others. Some of it we're dealing with every day, so we don't forget it. But then the reluctance to have a pre-assessment, and we can get on a whole other thing of, am I writing good questions and stuff, but to have a pre-assessment, and then if that, qualifies. So there's audience reluctance, but I'm thinking with XAPI, all of a sudden you could record, hey, these are the people that scored this on the pre-assessment versus the post, which, so we know SCORM doesn't do that unless you have separate entities and make it kind of a mess. But then you can really set that up and then tie it to, hey, if mistakes were made, because that's going to have to take a lot of data in, are these people that, went through the training, people that didn't because they took the pretest and passed, and where those issues are. And obviously that's going to, if you can prove that and people have confidence in it, aka data, then that's a lot more efficient for everyone. People go through what they need, back to your personalization.
Yeah. Well, and so what's interesting, interesting in this one use case that we're doing where we're identifying, we're really honing the remediation, right? So we built, it's a domino course, right? So we build domino courses that have in-course remediation, right? So, and we use just straight up domino triggers. And this is all out of the box Domino data, XAPI data, right? You don't have to do anything. This is not a Domino commercial, but I mean, seriously, like our goal was to not make this harder on ourselves. So what can we use that comes out of the box, right? And so we've identified, right, what indicates struggling with the content. We have in-course remediation, but then we set this up, just like a demo of it, right? We set it up in a LearnShare LMS, and LearnShare has a almost full learning record store, one of the most full learning record stores inside the LMS itself. And we were able to, based on XAPI transactions in the LearnShare LMS, route courses, right? So take that as an expand, right? I could do a survey, or I could have a one learning experience in which I do a bunch of things, but if I score well or performance or something on a particular aspect of a course, that one statement could trigger inclusion or exclusion from, or waiving, right, out of entire other curricula. So there's so much we can do with this. And then we can measure, did it work?
So
Wow.
your phrase there, there's so much we can do with this. And I think once people sort of twig into this, it gets goosebumpy, etc.
Yeah.
And it seems like, oh, it's a no-brainer. We should be doing these things. But one of the things that 12 years in with XAPI is that lots of people remain not doing these things.
Or they're just doing SCORM things in a different language.
Or they're just doing SCORM. Well,
yeah.
Yeah.
And as Paul used the metaphor earlier about, being able to, be outside the box. But I also think from an industry perspective, it's hard to just even open the box initially when you're talking to XAPI.
Yeah, I think there's a few things going on, right? One was e-learning providers moved first. LMSs didn't move as fast, right? Small number of LMSs did, right? The LMSs most people have did not, right? Or they did, Paul would do like SCORM, but in a different language, right? And so yes, they do XAPI, launch, completion, quiz score, right? So that's basically SCORM. So there wasn't a lot of rich support from LMSs, and learning record stores are like fantastic tools, right? So you have this powerful learning record database from all the XAPI statements, and then data visualization on top of it, right? And how do I use that data and all these things, right? Data management, really great tools, but it means the organization has to buy another tool, which means they have to convince leadership that they need another tool. The leadership that has to approve that budget is asking us, just tell me who completed the course. And I get that from the LMS, right? So, we've had some challenges and some conversations around, actually a learning record store is way easier to stand up than an LMS. And it's way more interchangeable. And I actually just talked to an organization the other day, right? And what they're doing is they're not sure if they're changing their LMS out. They're not sure what they're doing with their other learning providers. Are doing a bunch of other things, but they know that if they get a learning record store and they send all their data to their learning record store, they can swap out any one of those other things without breaking the whole thing, because they've got their single source of truth in that data, right? So that then allows the L&D organization to be a lot more flexible and fluid. But we take a cost center in the business, right? Typically not a high power organization, right? We're not bringing in revenue, right? And so we have a harder road than maybe sales or marketing or somebody on the shop floor.
Yeah, I think about that, and you kind of mentioned some of the challenges of, and have over literally years and years had people who said, yeah, our LMS says they're adding an LRS, or they add an LRS and it violates all the rules of XAPI and only accepts a certain amount of data or something. And then it has no visualization. And I'm like, you don't go to Google Analytics and look at every hit. You never do that. maybe if you want to look at a specific problem, but you look at the data visualization. So they bring out there and it's like, oh yeah, you got a statement viewer with no visualization, and what's the point? But then also one of the things I think people lose on, because it's not always true of every tool set out there, but pretty much you could track SCORM data, not leave the LMS, and at the same time be sending XAPI data off to one or even more than one if you need to learning record store. And people kind of forget about that, and that you can even start, as you said, small with the data set that you're looking to track if costs are an issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that's, I mean, I think when you can do that hybrid publish, I can send SCORM to my LMS, make my LMS happy, and send XAPI data somewhere else and make me happy, and ultimately make my business happy, right? Right.
Yeah.
What does a low power organization within the organization do to gain power? You should bring data, bring good data, get it right, folks. But bring data and back up your assertions.
Yeah, that's the other thing about data I've heard in talking to other folks is, one, sometimes they're like, we actually now have better data than the organization about how they're, and I'm like, of course, we all know that's kind of sad too in certain areas, but sometimes they have data, but it's in a different format. And that's one of the cool things about XAPI. It is a standard format. And then also, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but with Gen AI, one of the great things that it can do is help us that are, I call baby programmers become intermediate programmers, not only learning, but, having a really good assistance, or people that need to transform data from one format into another so they can actually talk together. Now that's not so hard anymore.
It's not so hard. I can do some basic analysis in my generative AI tools, right? I think this is an opportunity for us, right? So I published a book on data and analytics for instructional designers, which came out 3 months. It was literally being printed while ChatGPT was being released. It was like whoosh. I'm like really good at timing. But now we have tools that enable us to analyze data with. And Julian Davis, by the way, in Australia is doing some great work around, analyzing XAPI data with AI. And I think there's a lot of possibilities. We got talking about LMSs and providers. I want to help folks because people have LMSs. They're not just going to change those out overnight. So Art Workentine and I, a couple of years ago, wrote an article on questions to ask your vendors, right? When you are buying an XAPI tool, so you don't get the, yeah, we do XAPI, right? And then you say, great, and then you move on, because I even got fooled by that once, right? I'm like, great, they said they do XAPI, made a too hasty recommendation. So Art and I sat down and wrote an article because I thought that was really important. We also, if you're curious about whether or not your LMS supports XAPI in a useful way, we created a free LMS test page. You don't have to log in to get any of the resources on it. It's got a couple of courses, a CMI5 course, and it's just straight XAPI course. And the answer key, what should you be getting out of your LMS? And it's just free, and it's just sitting there, so we can paste that link in the chat too. So we have some opportunities to help people, because we really want to help people get it right.
Yeah, there was a comment in there I think we want to address from Wendy, asking about what can those of us with other learning management systems to do to get around getting data like this, D2L, Brightspace, and I know there's a couple different methods, and I'm sure you run into them, Megan, about, hey, I need to get that SCORM data, but they don't have XAPI, so I'm going to have an LRS, but how can I be getting both at the same time?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that we're working with clients doing, right? So one is if you can get the API, right, get access to a platform's APIs. Many platforms have API, not XAPI, but an API that allow you to pipe their data out of one platform and into another, right? So you can pipe that over to your learning record store, convert it to XAPI, and it's way in. The other is to have a learning package, whether it's an e-learning like package or an H5P or a video wrapped with Jeff Batt's video wrapper, or a Domino published course, right, that sits into a D2L or a Canvas or whatever LMS, and you can have that, right, live in that LMS and send XAPI data out to your, I used to call it the sidecar learning record store, right? It's taken on a lot more importance than sidecar might represent, right? But you've got this on the side, you're running your LMS, your learners never even see that there's a learning record store going on, right? That's an option too. We're looking at different ways, and in some cases it's a platform by platform. What are the different ways in which we're going to get this? We're working with a client right now, talking with, they have an LMS. You know what? Their LMS works for them for so many things, but not for data for reporting and a couple of other things. So what we're looking at is, how do we get as much data as possible out of the LMS using the LMS's API? How do we, right? Maybe we just run a batch export of SCORM data, convert that to XAPI, put that in the learning record source. Then we have assessment data, we have course data, and then we're going to build some useful utilities on top of that around assessment building and some custom things that are important to them, pull all that. And then instead of fighting the LMS for boring reports, they're going to work within a learning record store to get much more interesting and useful reports.
Mm-hmm. Very cool.
Yeah, that's
Gang.
I was going to add in one thing there before you there is the, I mean, there's a lot of different ways at the end of the day to get that data. I mean, the sidecar, there's like Domino and some others that have it out of the box, and those that don't. If you have a good team like Torrance or someone to help you out, they can create an out of the box sidecar path. I've even seen folks like at Veracity, the sidecar didn't work because it wasn't secure enough. The LMS was too hard to work with to get the data out. So they actually built a middleware wrapper. So the course is sending the data, they're intercepting the data and sending it to the LRS and then letting the rest go through the SCORM. So there's ways.
There's lots of ways, yeah. And you know what, here's the thing, and there's a question, somebody, I think it was Wendy who said, a developing developer, right? For software developers, this stuff is not hard, right? This is straight up API, straight up JavaScript stuff. Like, this is not rocket science. So that's another good thing this has going for it.
Mm-hmm. 12 years, heading into the teenage stretch of things, going into high school, gang. XAPI.
Hope we took good care of the kids early so they turn out good.
That's right.
We did.
Yeah.
I think we did. We set them up for success.
Awesome. Megan, as always, thanks so much for joining us. Absolutely lovely. Love your ideas. Love your energy and your enthusiasm too, your passion. Thanks for bringing that.
A lot of coffee.
Yeah, fair enough. That's what we're all about here as well. Gang, it is time to dance on out of here. Join us in 2 weeks' time. Another discussion about accessibility and other similar related topics. We're going to swing back to that in a couple of weeks with Sarah Mercier, another very passionate person in our industry and space. So that's going to be a great conversation. As always, remember XAPI, instructional designers. Too many acronyms. Idiotic here. Hey, what we do here is sponsored by Domino. Check us out, www.domino.com. That's DOMINKNOW.com. Happy to chat more about what we can help you with XAPI and learning analytics and things like that. So time to dance on out. Thanks so much for joining us here today. Happy Wednesday all. Carry you on and to catch you in 2 weeks.